Hello, welcome to It Ain't You, the show that represents the history of ethnic minority groups in the US and where knowledge becomes power. If you don't know, now you know. We're Estar,
Nyke, Bella.
your very real hosts.
I was like, yeah, the military housing, all of this stuff, you're getting this. And this is again happening in the what becomes known in America actually as the anti-war time. Um, this is when you get a lot of people who are like, there are all these other freedoms that you're not giving us. We've got these amendments, but you're not paying attention to them. So we're going to take our amendments seriously, which rolls into, again, this is what kind of sets off even more so civil rights.
Right.
And even the kind of like sexual freedom thing, like it sets it off because people are like, okay, so we do have all these rights that essentially the powers that be are kind of like not paying attention to. um why don't we just take it into our own hands?
Yeah.
Pretty much, it's always this: the squeaky wheel gets the oil.
Exactly.
So we're still dealing with stuff like that now, where the loudest people, they may not be the right people, but they're the loudest people. So people take that essentially seriously.
Right.
And this is also around the time when I've heard this said in a lot of particularly Black American circles, where they say that Dr. King was killed because he started to pursue actually helping out the poor.
Like,
So it wasn't
what action were they pointing to as their evidence?
So he started to, before, if you look at
the timeline,
essentially the beginning, yeah, if you look at the timeline of his stuff and you look at the beginning stages, it was definitely Black middle class to Black wealthy.
Yes, because that's where he was coming in from. That was who he was.
Exactly. And also too, a lot of Christians in the South, especially Black Christians, they were, and we're talking about Atlanta. Like, dude was in Atlanta. Like,
he was able to ride a train. Like,
thank you. And then there, and this is what I'm talking about, like the sanitization wasn't necessarily just white people. Even with the whole, what civil rights look like was very sanitized. Now, I talk about this all the time. Rosa Parks was not the original person, as much as I am, like, I'm not taking
I love her.
anything away from her, because it honestly, if it was not for her, like, I don't know why people think that mentioning the actual truth is
somehow not gonna help you. Yeah.
Right. So, but this is just the fact of the matter. They knew how it would work. This is what Du Bois was talking about when he talked about the souls of Black folk and double consciousness. The first person that they were actually going to go with to start and be the face of the bus boycotts in the South was actually a woman named Claudette Colvin. And at the time, she was only, I think she was 15, 16 or 17, somewhere in that range, right?
Super young for being a face of such a massive movement.
Right. So they were going to use her because the exact same thing that happened to Rosa is what happened to her.
Right. I feel like there's, at some point, and this might have happened in my head and whatnot, but like, it went from Rosa Parks was tired and she sat in the front row at the back of the bus, to she was tired and she was sat in the front of the bus, which she sat in the front row of the back half of the bus that was already designated and segregated for Black folks. And then the front of the bus became full because everybody was sitting. So all of a sudden there's someone who's of white descent who wants to go sit, and basically the bus driver is like, you need to move. You're telling a middle-aged Black woman who's probably worked a full day, who's really tired, get up and move so that these white people can take your spot.
Right.
that's the story that we're told, that she was
Right.
tired. But I think that I read that this was a calculated move.
Yes, it was. And let me
And there
tell
were
you
buzz
why.
protests like way before this for
Mm-hmm.
like over a year.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So the story that Rosa Parks was just tired, I don't know that
It
that
doesn't quite track. There's something kind of
Because, and this is what happens when you sanitize the history. This is what happens when you give the historiography instead
right.
of the actual history. Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin were actually friends. Even though Rosa Parks was older, they were actually friends because they're all working, and people don't know this either. Rosa Parks was already working for the
Yeah.
NAACP.
yeah.
She was very active
Like,
in the circle. She's highly intelligent. They want her
thank
because
you.
she's intelligent. They want her because
Right.
she's already part of the cause.
Thank you. So what happens is essentially dirty laundry would be aired out if they would go with Claudette. On the out, like, even if they didn't know the actual details of it,
It
now you
doesn't
have a
look
pregnant
good.
17-year-old Black girl,
Uh-huh.
and you're trying to say that she's gonna be the face of our bus boycotts.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone wants the grandma who they could back.
Thank you. No, we're going to get the older looking
the
Black woman,
auntie, the
right?
mom,
Who,
and not
thank you,
necessarily
who's
the youngster.
tired.
Right?
Thank you. Who's tired, who just worked a full day, probably was, again, because the look of Rosa Parks, even if you look at the picture, the look of
Uh-huh.
Rosa Parks, a stereotypical Black woman, like middle-aged Black woman,
Mm-hmm.
who was probably housekeeping for a white family. And I'm not trying to say that it didn't work in the boycott's favor.
It worked a little too well, I think.
Right. So again, there's all this. And so going back to like how it goes back to even the sanitization of Dr. King,
Uh-huh.
we're getting it to him. He starts, like, you start to see this change where he talks more about, this is when you get the quote of him saying, you know, how are you going to tell a Black person to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps when they don't even have boots? They don't even have shoes, like string. Like, what? How are you going to tell them that when they don't have the minimum it takes to even pull themselves up? And this is also another lie that I learned even doing some Korean history. A lot of these wealthy people,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them, they have this idea, or at least they kind of push out. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if they necessarily, but they kind of push out, or they present, which is kind of how people do it on Instagram and all of that stuff. They present the good part. So they push out this idea that they did it on their own.
Yeah.
Like, I'm self-made and all of this. And I'm like, no, if you look at Korean history, you either were in a certain position to make money, or you knew you could speak a certain
Mm-hmm.
language, or you
You were well read when it came to Chinese literature.
or right, or you were given something. Like, think about it, when people start businesses, you obviously have to have money to start the business.
Yep.
Some sort of money. No one really starts from $0. They have to have something to put into it, even if it's, again, even if it's $5. Yes, it can be something small, but
Mm-hmm.
still there is some money that has to go into making the money.
The seed
You
money.
need money to make money, right? So, because like even with these startups, like everybody's like, yeah, let's do a startup. For many of the startups that I've seen, 50K is like the minimum. And like, depending on where it is, but if we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do, like, say we're trying to do a medical startup, 50K is the minimum
That might
amount
last
that
you.
somebody has to give you
I feel like that might
a month.
last you. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Maybe
So
two if
you
you're
gotta,
very strategic and scrimping and saving a lot. But
exactly. So towards the end of a lot of his stuff,
mm-hmm.
Dr. King starts talking more about this. He even starts mentioning where he's like, I think in when it comes to money, he starts mentioning a lot of things that sound like socialism. And of course, this is the 60s when everybody thinks, I mean, granted, it was, some of it was
Mm-hmm.
actually like war. did, because in all honesty, the Soviet Union, I mean, granted, this also came from like what was happening from World War II, and a lot of people forget that Nazis were not necessarily
Yeah,
fascists. Nazi stands for socialism, but hey, that's neither here nor there. If people don't want to,
because
look into
well,
that.
I mean, they were also committing mass genocide, so that
Exactly, but it's like, do and to be honest, people don't want to talk about it, but I was like, Russia was doing it too, but it's okay. So was Italy, but again, the sanitization
of
of
history,
history.
the winner writes
So
writes the history books, or they write
exactly.
part of the history books.
Right. So we get again Dr. King, of course. So he's doing these things
Hmm.
with all these things. He's also working more with Asian Americans.
Where this
So
gets
before,
really interesting.
right. So before, everyone's like, okay, he's only, and this is why people also break it down to where he was only looking out for black people. No,
Hmm.
not at
It's just his
all. Like that was
language emphasizes the black person, but
right.
what does black
This is
actually mean?
Thank you. And then this is why nowadays when people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion,
Hmm.
they do, like a lot of people go, well, I've heard this coming from a lot of people who work in government spaces,
Hmm.
uh, when it comes to their basically what's happening with DEI is the same thing that happened with affirmative action. It's the
Yep.
same thing because a lot of people will choose a token to say, hey, we did this,
Hmm.
but don't really care. And then there's other people who you would think that this will be working for, who kind of buy the one thing, like, oh,
Yep.
they did this, so we're
Hmm.
good. Uh, or who again buy into the lie of this is actually going to work. And it's like on paper, it sounds great, but if the actions aren't following,
It's also not
it's not
working.
right. Like so that's I was like my little thing on that. But then again, going back to Dr. King.
Uh-huh.
So so before you're thinking he's only for black people. So then you could get him on that, because if he's only for black people, like, well, what about everybody else? What about the other people who are doing this? And what again, but he was never only for black people. He was in his community. And then when he saw other
Hmm.
people of other communities who were already close to the black community, of course, he's
Yeah.
like, wait, look, hold up, you doing the same thing to my brothers on the reservations. Like, what, can we not?
And
Like
not
can
just
we?
that, like he was also seeing, and this also goes for Malcolm X, because Malcolm X was very active. Actually, no, sorry. The Black Panther Party was very active in Oakland, where they started. So
Uh-huh.
all of this was going on pretty much at the same time, by the way. It wasn't like, oh, Dr. King was the last one. No. It was all going on at the same time.
And
And we're talking like what sounds like black civil rights.
mhm.
Oh no. This is also Asian American civil rights at
And
the same time.
this is another thing that I know Estar, like Estar found it, and so I went with her. It was
Mm.
an exhibit at Oxy's. What was the name of the museum?
S starts chewing on ice right now, so give her a
Uh
second.
oh. Sorry.
But like you were talking about how like, oh, people like attribute it to people attribute communism and like Dr. King's socialist tendencies, or like Malcolm X's socialist tendencies, to like the Soviet Union. There was another key
Right.
player. The Black Panther Party was reading Mao Zedong as a way to like get familiar with, like, hey, there's another way to run a country where
And
we're not, the butt of all the jokes, or like all the labor, and we're not being mistreated. People are supposed to be treated equally. So yeah.
and uh which I just wrote a story about, or not a story, I wrote a research paper on. They also become quite close to Kim Il Sung.
Ooh,
Yes.
that is
Like
See,
to the point where Eldridge Cleaver
uh-huh.
is, and this is documented, so this is not like,
This isn't like, oh,
I'm
we didn't see anything. We saw like
right.
them hang out. Like it was like Eldridge Cleaver and a lot of the Black Panther Party were by all means militant. Because so here's what's really fascinating.
They weren't first moving militant though.
Right.
This was all for protection.
Right. So they weren't like, oh, we're gonna carry a gun and we're gonna go after the policemen who are like offending us, and like they were literally just, there was a law in California that allowed this was in the 60s. They allowed people to openly carry loaded rifles.
Yep.
As long as it wasn't pointed at someone.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it was Eldridge. I have it written down somewhere.
I mean, there's also, they were also claiming, what is that, the Second Amendment? The right to bear arms?
Yes. But this was a specifically like California law.
Oh, yeah. Of course, California had one too.
But basically, let me see if I could find it. But so when they started creating the Black Panther Party and they started creating this whole concept of like, we're going to bear arms to protect our community from police brutality, one of their founders, he may as well have founded a law school, I feel like, because he studied all the laws that came to carrying arms.
This is why we love Huey, but this is why there's also this is why people don't understand the Boondocks. Sorry.
But
I'm just saying.
This is also, I feel like, when we were talking earlier how like they were very careful in how they picked Rosa Parks for the image, right? This is where I feel like you start to see maybe the Black Panthers were a little bit too young to like realize the marketing image. Because now 60 plus years later, what is your impression of the Black Panthers? They carry rifles. They stormed the Sacramento Capitol building.
Black leather.
And they wore berets. They looked very militant. Right?
But they wore afros.
Yes.
But this is why hair
became
is a thing.
And is such a big issue now for why it shouldn't be, but it is, because that's the image that people think of now, right? But the Black Panthers, when they started, they're very well read when it comes to socialist literature. So one of the things that they were doing early on was creating community programs. That was, I mean, like if we're saying Martin Luther King started doing that towards the end, Black Panthers were doing that starting in the very beginning.
Right.
And
so
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say,
go ahead.
It was so much so that within, I want to say the first 2 or 3 years, right, where like, they're making a name for themselves. They're starting to carry arms. The police are getting a little bit scared of them. The FBI gets called in, and oh my gosh, I have to remember the name right now, but basically the FBI, I'm not quoting the exact quote, but paraphrasing it, they thought that the Black Panther Party was the greatest internal threat to national security. A bunch of college-aged, gun-carrying kids trying to protect their community is a national threat.
Again, Dr. King was how old when they killed him?
39.
But he was already doing stuff in his 20s. All of those sit-ins, the majority of those sit-ins were young kids who were either in college or had just graduated.
They were educated. Educated minds are scary to people who want to, how do I put this?
Control.
Yes. That is the nice way. I was more like to dictate.
That's the nice way. Yes, that's the nice way. But again, this is why, and to be honest, it's not a new thing, and it's not only like people would say it's not only white people. It's not anything. It's people who again want to as we nicely put it, control.
And it's not
And
just the US, and it's not unique to
right,
modern day America. This has been
not
going
at
on
all,
since you can record time.
pretty much.
So
But yeah, I
it ain't
was
new.
mentioning, right? It's not new, people.
Way to bring it
ain't
back.
new, people.
We gotta bring it. It ain't new. None of this is new.
Yes,
This is all.
none of this is new.
We're saying that, hey, guys, remember, this was 60 years ago. Yeah, and even then, it was 100 years ago. It was 200 years ago.
Right. So I was saying, like, with the sanitization of Martin Luther King, because now he's moving into these spaces and he's getting closer with other people.
Right.
Like, everybody already knew his a lot of his nonviolent stuff came from not just the Bible, but also
Mahatma Gandhi.
Gandhi, and that's another person that's been highly sanitized. But again, all this sanitization, this is the real point that I was trying to make. This is where you get the sweeping under the rug of a lot of Asian activists.
Right.
And how, again, it doesn't come until what I see, Oxy essentially doing that whole exhibit. We're talking about Occidental College doing that whole exhibit where they're like, oh, wait, there were American activists back then? Duh. There were Asian American activists in the 1800s.
That exhibit at Oxy was Voice a Wild Dream, Asian American activism from 1968 to 2022.
Yeah.
And see, and I'm glad they did that, but there were others before as well. Like, it's like, and it's, part of it is, to be honest, I do say this a lot, especially when Black History Month rolls around.
Say it. Say it.
I know people are going to be like upset, but to be honest, I don't care on this one. I am a fan of, and I will advocate for, teaching your own children.
Yes.
And even if you expand it to where, of course, you know, you might be teaching other kids. I mean, that goes back to It Takes a Village. But like, when I look at it, this is for me why it really goes back to this. Why, as a Black woman in America, well, not Korea, but in America,
the majority of your experience has been Black in the United States.
Black in the United States, yes. I will vote.
Yes.
I will study. Like,
yes.
I will read on my own. Because those two things, people literally died for. They were so afraid of people knowing the way things work that they did not allow certain people, like, it was literally in law for people who looked like me.
Yes.
And also for people who didn't necessarily look like me, to not read or write or be educated.
So I'm going to take this opportunity to say, if you don't know what we're talking about, go back to our episodes about art as resistance.
Yes.
Because we talk about why this is so important. We talk about why education and the fact that there were enslaved Black folks who, you know, against all odds, learned how to read and write. And why, like, once they did, they went and became so productive in publishing works and saying, we need to record this. So,
and starting schools.
Yes.
Literally, I know of a gentleman, I can't remember what year it was, but they wouldn't let Black kids go to school. So he started a school on a boat.
So,
because
if you're listening to this and you're going, what are you guys talking about? Go to our episode, Art as Resistance. Actually, go by, you know, also listen to the rest of our podcast.
Listen to all previous episodes. Yes.
But
so again, and this is why when I mean, I fully believe, just like Malcolm X, Dr. King's thing was a setup. And of course, this has also been said in a bunch of Black circles too, that there were certain people around Dr. King that didn't like not what he was standing for, but they didn't like the fame that he was getting. And we're not talking about like fame, like people like you. We're talking about he was becoming infamous.
Thank you all for listening to It Ain't New, where if you don't know, now you know. We're Nyke,
Bella,
Estar.
Please show us some love on Spotify by leaving us a rating or a review, and join our Patreon so we can grow and continue to give you all wonderful content.